Welcome to Previously on X-Men, the podcast that looks at X-Men comics, movies, shows, characters, and more. I'm Hilary.
I'm Nick.
Hi, Nick.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, Hilary. I come bearing gifts today.
You do?
Yes, you know I have a day job at a library, right?
I'm familiar.
Okay. Well, I was doing an interview with Mike Vosburg. Mike Vosburg is an artist who's worked in comics, worked in television, done all sorts of things. So while I was interviewing him for the David A. Howe Public Library, I figured I should probably ask him some questions for Previously on X-Men.
I appreciate that.
Yes. Now, as you probably know, Mike Vosburg is best known for his work on the Savage She-Hulk. He did 24 issues of that, the original She-Hulk run, and that was his long-running series there. But he also worked with Chris Claremont on the original Ms. Marvel series, including the issues where her powers are absorbed by Rogue.
Those are great issues.
I know, so a pretty legendary bit of comic book history,
Yeah.
and you'll see that apparently was news to him. The the importance of those issues and how they've affected the characters over the years.
Why is it? It feels like whenever we talk to artists,
Yeah.
they don't seem to super care about comics.
Yeah, it's true. That's
They're
true.
all just like, I don't know, I'm doing a job, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I know you did that interview with Aletha Martinez a while back, and she was kind of like that too. You know, she was like, I got these assignments who were great, in and out.
I think they just appreciate the work.
I think they do too. Yeah. And his work is great. He's done tons of work with Marvel and DC. In the X-Men realm, he did the Beast Spider-Man story in Marvel Team Up number 90. He did What If Dazzler became the Herald of Galactus in What If number 33.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I haven't read a lot of What Ifs.
What If was back in the day, like in my diving comic book long boxes, you know, the quarter bins underneath. I was constantly looking for What Ifs.
That sounds right.
And one of my favorites was What If Phoenix Had Lived.
Uh-huh.
That was one that I actually saved up money
So
for.
what if Phoenix had lived?
Everybody else doesn't.
Cool.
Yeah, it's
Cool.
pretty much just her. He also reteamed with his Cloak and Dagger partner, Terry Austin, for X-Men Annual number 13th, which was part of that huge Atlantis attack saga.
Ah, okay.
Aside from comics, he also worked pretty extensively in television and film, particularly in Marvel animation. He worked as a storyboard artist on shows like Ultimate Spider-Man, Avengers, Earth Mightiest Heroes, Hulk and the Agents of Smash, where he got to do a little bit more She-Hulk, and of course, Wolverine and the X-Men.
Hey, nice.
I loved Wolverine and the X-Men.
Yeah.
I was so disappointed. You remember how that ends? It ends on a big, like, Age of Apocalypse cliffhanger.
Yeah, and then no more.
And they just never made
The
any
end.
more. I love it. I'm excited for when you guys get to that on the podcast
Yeah.
because I haven't watched that show since it was, like, on.
I just saw it the once.
Since it was airing. Yeah, I know. Anyway, so we kind of got into a little bit of all of this, talking about his long career in comics and animation. So
That's cool.
Should we get into it?
Yeah, let's roll the tape.
Today I'm here with artist Mike Vosburg. Mike, thanks for joining us here on Previously on X-Men.
Oh, you're welcome, Nick.
So, you know, I was trying to figure out where I first came across your work, and I was assuming it was the Savage She-Hulk. But actually, as I was looking more into your TV credits, I think it would have been the Superpowers team Galactic Guardians. Now, I was a huge fan of all things Super Friends, and I know this was an early entry in your TV career. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about working on the Superpowers team and how that got going and what your experience was like.
My first work that I was doing in animation was for a man named Bob Dranko, and then we worked together on Bionic 6.
Okay.
So I was doing some things like that for Bob, so that's where the credit came from. You know, you do things like man holding the shovel.
Sure.
You know? So I wasn't really familiar, like, okay, what show is this for?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I know, you know, a lot of things in animation of that time and even earlier, you'd see recurring backgrounds kind of pop up, whether it was, you know, He-Man or Star Trek, the animated series or whatever. Sometimes you'd see some of those same backgrounds. So that's how it was? You just kind of got specific assignments and they'd put them on whatever show needed them?
Yeah. I mean, it's like every show that would come out, you'd get the script, and then someone would go through the script, and they would go how many backgrounds they needed, whether 3, 4, 5, or, you know, depending on the budget of the show, too.
Okay.
And then they would also go through, are there new characters? Do we need to design a new character? And then it would be props.
Mm-hmm.
You know, whatever it was that they needed, and you would end up drawing that. And so those were kind of the first things I was doing in animation. I was working in comics at the time, but I was looking for freelance work because I just moved out here. So that was the first things. Within a year or so, I was doing a lot of work, storyboard work for Marvel Studios on G.I. Joe.
Sure.
And the other show was actually Gem.
I love Gem. I loved Gem back in the day. That was one of my favorites.
I did a lot of the music videos.
Oh, okay.
My wife and I had moved here to Los Angeles, and particularly in Tahunga, because I had been working on a create-our-own series through Marvel called Sisterhood of Steel.
Okay.
And the writer on that was Christy Marks. And Christy and her husband lived here in Tahunga, so I had visited them, and I thought, well, when we move to Los Angeles, that's a good place to, we'll find a place there, and then we can, find out where we want to live after that.
Yeah.
And we've never made it out of Tahunga. We love it here. So, but also, Christy was the one who developed the whole Gem series.
Okay.
As well as she had written a number of the G.I. Joe scripts. So she was, she was a good, I guess, conduit for me in terms of, okay, you should go talk to these people, and they're looking for artists. And at the time, Marvel was just gearing up to do all the animation work. They had a ton of animation work.
Oh, yeah.
And they didn't have enough people to do it. And I can remember, I was here, and I would show my work, and they would go, well, you do comic books. You really don't know how to do storyboards.
Okay.
And I'd go, fine. It's something I can learn. And the guy who hired me at Marvel said, look, I'll tell you what we'll do is we're going to bring you in as an assistant to someone, and you can kind of, help them on a board.
Okay.
To kind of learn the process.
Oh, okay. I see.
And the next time I talked to him, I said, well, we actually, we don't have anybody like that right now because they're all busy doing their own stuff. So I think we might do is have you come in, and we'll give you a board, and we'll supervise you while you do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, okay. And then when I went to get the board, they went, hey, look, we don't have any space right now for you to come in, so just take the board, go home and do it, and when you bring it back, we'll fix it as best we can.
Okay, wow.
And I went, okay. So I came home and I did the board. I brought it back, and they looked at it and went, oh, wow, you want a job? You're hired.
Oh, wow.
And,
that's...
well, I mean, my influence as an artist was far more in film than it was in comics. I mean, I love comic books, but for storytelling, I had always been in love with movies.
Mm-hmm.
So, like my friend Warren Greenwood told me one time, he said, oh, you want to draw storyboards? Well, I can explain you how to do that if you got about 15 minutes. So okay. And, there were things you had to learn about in film. The size of, what you're looking at remains the same all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, whereas in comic books, you could do like 20 panels on a page or one panel, and, change the size of them, change the shape of them. When you were doing storyboards, you always worked on one size frame, with the 3 to 4 ratio, whatever it was. So, I mean, you had to learn that, and you had to learn about screen direction, which they gave me these really complicated things about you don't cross the line of axis, and blah, blah, blah. And basically, somebody else explained it to me very simply, and they said, hey, look, if you've got your character and you draw them on the right side of the screen in the first part, you can't draw him on the left side unless you show how he gets there.
Mm.
And I went, oh, that's pretty simple.
Yeah.
So, there were things like that I had to kind of pay attention to.
Yeah.
But, I mean, one of the things they were running into were they had, just, the best guys in comics, like Joe Kane and Jack Kirby.
Sure.
Were doing boards for them, and they weren't adapting to what they were doing. They were drawing comic book stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, they were very successful at that, and that's what they did. So there were other guys that they were bringing in at the same time, and that was kind of a common problem was that, well, we get these great-looking boards, but they're comic books.
Mm.
So, I mean, the fact that when I turned in the board, it was, 90-95% accurate for them in terms of what you wanted to do on that. They said, hey, you want a job? It was far more money than I was making in comics.
I'm sure,
far less work.
Yeah. So how much of the skills that you gained as a comic book artist, like how helpful were those in transitioning here? And what were some of the things you had to kind of relearn moving to a different medium like that?
Well, for one thing, in comic books, you had to draw quickly, you had to draw accurately and cleanly. Well, all those things applied in storyboards, but the level of drawing that you had to apply in a comic book, you didn't have to do that in a storyboard.
Sure.
So what I normally saw when I was starting to work in comics, guys were always complaining about the deadline.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, oh my God, how am I going to get this done? We only got 2 weeks to do this third of an act that they'd give us.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I wasn't struggling with the drawing at all. So, I mean, it wasn't like I was sitting there every day going like, okay, here's this guy's shoe. How do I do it? Because those were things that I like I said, I had spent a lot of time, worked out. I was working, for photo reference on things. So I didn't have to spend a lot of time working on to get the drawing correct.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the biggest criticism they would always give me was that, like, well, the drawings here are real pretty, but I mean, you've got to be careful about the film sense.
Okay.
And which was a fair assessment, but at the same time, it's like, what I was doing with my approach to film was pretty strong too.
Okay.
So depending on what editor you worked with, they had their own little dogma that they wanted you to follow.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the guys I worked with used to drive me nuts. After I'd come out of the office, the producer would come out and go like, "Mike, I'm so sorry. He does that. I'm really don't listen to it, but you do it." And his thing was always, make sure you get the characters right in the middle of the frame.
Oh, okay.
Don't ever show the back of anyone. And it's like all these things that were like, well, that's interesting storytelling. Oh, no, you want to do it this way, man. So,
yeah, that seems a little limiting.
Yeah. So it was, those were the kind of things that I really, learned. And like my friend Warren explained, that'll take 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And there were always little things as, one of the things I didn't do enough of, it probably would have been a great help, was when you did a storyboard, the pencil tests came back, or, from the studio, and you would sit around and you look at them and you kind of see like, ooh, that looked great on the board, but doesn't quite work here. I would get less involved in that. I mean, that would have been helpful, but then on the other hand, I didn't want to become a director or a producer, whatever.
Sure.
It was, for me, it was just like, okay, I want to make sure I got a good, clean board for you, and move on from there.
Well, looking at your list of credits, I feel like you hit a lot of the things that were my favorites growing up. So that's just kind of fun to see all the different projects you had the opportunity to work on. Now, I'm curious, like going back even earlier, you grew up in Michigan, right?
Right.
Yeah, what part of Michigan are you from? I'm from Battle Creek.
Ooh, well, see, I lived in Battle Creek for a while.
Oh, did you?
But I lived in Battle Creek later. I grew up in Pontiac.
Sure, yeah. I have family in Pontiac, yep.
So, I mean, the good thing was I was in high school when Jerry Bales started to put out his alter ego fanzine and basically started comic book fandom.
Okay.
So, from the beginning, I was introduced to all these guys who were doing their own fanzines.
Sure.
And so, there was guys in the neighborhood. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager, Jim Starlin.
Yeah.
Lived in about 20 miles away in Berkeley, and he was like 13 at the time. I was probably 16 or 17. I remember him riding his bicycle out to my house, friend.
Yeah.
And I came home from like whatever it was, football practice or something, and there's this kid that's like, hey, we heard you made fanzine. And so we became good friends, and when I got ready to, he introduced me to Milgram because that was his buddy from high school there in Berkeley.
Wow.
Boy, who else at the time? There was Rich Buckler was doing stuff.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's like, I'm sure Jerry probably introduced us to all these guys.
Mm-hmm.
And when I finished college, I taught school for 3 years.
Okay. Until
my draft deferment. My number was high enough that I was finished with the draft.
Okay.
So when that was done, I had a certain amount of freedom that I said, well, I'd kind of like to, think about comics. What made it real for me was Starlin was just back from the Navy at the time, and he had gotten work at Marvel.
Okay.
And in my youthful arrogance, it was like, wow, Jim could get work. Maybe I could get work too.
And
what you have to remember is growing up in Pontiac, the idea of drawing for comic books, I was like saying, I'm going to move to Hollywood and become a movie star.
Sure, no, of course.
It was, it was a dream job.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, like I said, seeing guys like Buckler and Starlin and like I said, Milgram followed pretty soon after. And there was a whole slew of guys from Detroit. There was Terry Austin and Mike Nasser and Arvil Jones later on. So, I mean, there was no shortage of people. And we were all working together as fans.
Yeah.
So we get a lot of criticism of our work. And when I say criticism, we get helpful criticism.
Sure, yeah.
In terms of, you should be trying to do this or you should be trying to do that.
Well, it sounds like a pretty good cohort you were working in. So, yeah, I imagine that would be very helpful input.
It's like one of the other funny things I always remember was I get a call from these two teenagers in Levittown, New York, who called me Collect of all things and said, hey, we heard you could do a fanzine. Could could you explain to us how you do one?
Oh, wow.
And so I spent 30, 40 minutes on the phone with them and then explained to them great, I hope that helps. Next time, please, don't call me collect.
Right, yeah.
And that was Len Wein and Marv Wolfman.
Oh, jeez.
So, I mean, that's kind of the way things were being done at the time. And, of course, by the time I broke into comics, they were both, well established. So I did some work for Marv. I never did do anything with Len for some reason.
Yeah.
He always talked to me, Rita's got to do something, but it never quite happened. So,
was there anybody that you kind of looked up to, or when you were trying to break in, that you were like, man, this is the artist I love? Was there anyone like that you were a fan of, or someone whose work you admired that you eventually did get to work with?
My two real heroes in comics were Joe Kubert.
Sure.
That I wrote to. I sent him 100 letters when I was in high school, and he wrote back a couple times, which I was thrilled about.
Yeah, that's exciting.
And Leonard Starr.
Mm-hmm.
And Leonard, I got to meet, I got to be good friends both with Joe and Leonard as time went on, and they were guys that I truly admired and I loved talking to. But they were really the guys I was looking at.
Sure.
Gil Kane was someone that I got to be good friends with later. But as a fan, I never liked his work. Well, once I got to learn a little more about comics, I really came to appreciate what Gil could do as an artist.
Yeah.
And I also understood, I didn't see Gil's pencils, I just saw the finished stuff that had been in.
Right.
And, I mean, and the classic one for me was Alex Toth. I mean, as a kid, I hated Alex Toth because he did an adaptation of The Time Machine.
Okay.
And every guy in the film, he did these wonderful likenesses of Rod Taylor and Sebastian Cabot. But Yvette Mimieux, who was my heartthrob at the time, was in that movie, and his likeness was nothing like her.
No.
I was like, who is this hack? And his style reminded me very much of Milton Caniff, who was another guy that I didn't appreciate his thinking style. I thought it looked like, he'd used a toothbrush and, he'd used this rough line.
Yeah.
And I didn't appreciate the artistry that he was creating with his use of blacks and things like that. I was in a much slicker approach to the work.
Okay.
So, I mean, when I broke into comics, there weren't guys like that I was really big fans of. Probably the guys that were working in comics at the time that I saw that I thought, wow, I really love their work, was John Buscema.
Sure, yeah.
And Gene Colan.
Okay.
But even Gene Colan stuff, I was familiar with his stuff from Creepy and Eerie, and I loved it when he inked himself.
Okay.
And he would do these tonal things. And oddly enough, Gene's the guy I never met.
Oh.
One of my other idols that I did get to meet fairly quickly was I met Wally Wood a couple times.
Okay.
And, talk about youthful arrogance. My friend Al Milgram told me, he said, yeah, I showed Wally some of your work, and he said, wow, this guy draws girls almost as well as I do. And I remember thinking at the time, almost.
Yeah, you mentioned Jack Kirby earlier. Is that someone you ever crossed paths with?
Yes, I did, oddly enough. But once I moved out here, I was with another friend who was a comic book artist one day, and we're walking along someplace in Burbank, and he goes, oh my God, there's Jack Kirby. And he rushes over, and he was with Roz, and and Jack was just, I mean, talk about an ambassador to comics. He was just the sweetest man. He went, we live up in Thousand Oaks. You really have to come up and see us sometime.
Oh, wow.
And unfortunately, I never did. I think I probably met him once or twice after that.
Mm-hmm.
There was an organization out here called TAPS, which a lot of these people belong to. So, I mean, I would see Sergio Aragones and...
Oh, wow, okay.
Who else? Russ Heath was here eventually, and it was a good thing like that.
Yeah, I mean, a Kirby sighting in the street sounds pretty exciting to me. So, I mean, that's a pretty cool one right there. What was
it was fortunate I was with a friend who knew who he was.
Who recognized him on sight, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So what was the first job you got, either Marvel or DC, where you felt like, oh, wow, this is it. This is the thing. I'm doing it.
Actually, the first work that I did in comics were for Underground Comics.
Okay.
Which it was a way to get your work published.
Yeah.
I mean, Underground Comics at the time were basically, it was kind of very political, pornographic, or guys that wanted to draw comics.
Okay.
I kind of fit into the latter.
Okay.
Because my stuff was, mildly erotic, but not pornographic. And I didn't really have too much of an interest in doing anything too overtly political.
Yeah.
But I did get a few stories published there, so it was same way in working in fanzines. It gave me a chance to see what happened to the work in reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're drawing the stuff and it looks, oh, this looks really cool, and you forget it's going to be printed in comics. It's going to be shrunk down. It's going to be colored. It's going to be lettered over. You got all these things going on, and that was the other thing. In fanzines, you were doing all that stuff yourself. Well, in working in comics, they actually had professionals that were doing that stuff. You'd actually read the lettering after they did it.
Right.
So when I came into New York, I think the first 2 or 3 visits in there, again, I'd stayed with, I think, Starlin or Milgram, probably Milgram, who was sharing room with Simonson at the same time, too. So, I mean, and like Chaikin was in the building next door, so was Bernie Wrightson. So, I mean, you'd run into all these guys, and they were all, like, hey, they're doing some new stuff over at, D.C., you should talk to so-and-so over there about this and that. So, I mean, I would come in and I would see, I think Joe Orlando was the art director then.
Okay.
He's a guy who I eventually was working with, and he was probably one of the very few editors who actually gave me any helpful advice about drawing and what I was doing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest problem, most of them looked at me and they went, oh, you're 24. You're probably way too old, actually, if you're not working in comics now.
Too old? Oh, okay.
You're too old,
Wow.
Well, that's the thing. Is like, if you're not Neil Adams and drawing your own syndicated strip at 21, you're too late.
You're too late.
And
your grandpa.
you also have to understand that most of these guys that were older, Kubert and Leonard Starr and Alex Toth and Carmine and Gil Kane, they all were working when they were teenagers. They would come in and,
wow.
That's what the industry was back in the late 30s and early 40s. So it didn't seem strange for these guys to go like, yeah, I've been working since I was, Kubert, I think, started when he was 13 or 14.
That early.
All these guys, by the time they were in high school, they were all working and doing things. So for them, it was like, wow, if you're 21 and you're not working, it's probably too late for you already.
Jeez.
But that didn't faze me very much. I mean, I thought, I understood at the time that Hal Foster didn't start his Prince Valiant strip until he was 39 years old. So I thought,
oh, really?
Yeah, there's still hope.
Okay.
Well, he did Tarzan for years before that.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, he was a guy who hitchhiked from the wilds of Canada or wherever he was at to Chicago and went to art school there for, a year or so.
Okay.
And then went out and started getting work. But, I mean, it was that old, the age thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And like I said, what I saw was far more important was it's not when you start, it's when you stop improving.
Mm.
And one of the things that I saw both in animation and comics were a lot of guys would start out and they'd be really good, but they wouldn't get any better. I mean, it was like, okay, I mean, the reality of comics was it didn't matter if you were one of the best guys or the worst guys. The difference in rates weren't that different.
Oh, okay.
I mean, one guy might be making $20 a page, the other guy might be making $40 a page. But I mean, it wasn't like the guy making 40 was driving a Cadillac.
Right.
When I came out here and I started working in animation, I remember them offering me $1,000 a week, and I was like, "Oh my God!"
Yeah. You've made it.
So I mean, at the time I was probably making $20,000 at the most in comics.
Okay.
For a year. So the idea of suddenly being offered a job where they were going to pay me $50,000 a year, I was astounded.
Big time, for sure.
Of course, in comics, they offered a marginal amount of royalty payments, things like that.
Oh, okay.
But it was not any, it was, if you made a few $100s for doing that issue of a comic, you might get another 100 or two for the royalties on the book.
Okay.
I mean, there were a few things that I did. I remember like some of the G.I. Joe stuff. It was like, oh wow, off the royalties I was getting off G.I. Joe, I remember buying a new car. But at the time, you have to remember that new car cost about $3,000 to $4,000.
A little different.
So I mean, it wasn't, and that wasn't off one issue. That was. I remember there was a time later on where I did an issue, an X-Men annual. And the royalties off that, I literally did go out and buy a new car.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah. I mean, again, it wasn't It wasn't a new Mercedes.
But still.
But like I said, it was enough to pay for it. And it was also an interesting lesson about the business itself, because I was working with Terry Austin at the time, and we were doing Cloak and Dagger.
Yeah.
That was our series. And Terry called me and said, hey, I'm going to do an X-Men annual. Would you like to work on it with me? And I'm like, well, sure, yeah, Cloak and Dagger came out, and it sold, if it sold 100,000 copies, it was going to be lucky. And our royalties were, $200 at most off an issue. And at the same time, we had suddenly our X-Men annual came out, and it sold 500,000 copies, and we were making thousands in royalties. And I'm going,
wow.
Exactly the same creative team, but one book is selling
one different.
500,000.
Yeah.
The other, the other is hardly breaking 100,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it brought home that lesson of, it's not so much who's doing the book sometimes, it's who, what the book is, who the characters are.
Sure. Now I know in that X-Men annual, that's annual number 13. That book is heavy on Colossus and Wolverine and Rogue in particular. And I know that you'd done kind of a legendary Rogue story early on when you were working with Chris Claremont on Ms. Marvel. Could you talk a little bit about the Ms. Marvel run you did there and the collaboration with Claremont?
Wow, you're really going to bring up painful memories, aren't you?
Oh, wow. I guess so.
No. Actually, I think I did. I think Chris probably wrote the Ms. Marvel. I was doing the book, and I did about 3 stories in the book, and they were canceling it for whatever reason. I'm not sure what it was.
Yeah, I was curious about that, because it seems like that story resolved years later in the kind of an umbrella book, Marvel Superheroes. So I was kind of wondering how that all went down.
Well, I was going to say, I think we had one story left over that was some supervillain and took place in a subway, and they were having a big battle, and that was how that story was going to be resolved.
Okay.
And at the same time, they said, hey, we want to do a further adventure with Ms. Marvel and Iron Man, and I think we're going to bring in the Rogue characters and things like that. But I remember I did the first one for Ms. Marvel, and I got to ink it myself.
Oh, okay.
And I was like, wow, great, because that's really what I want to do in comics. This will give people a chance to see what I can do. Well, of course, after I did the book, it never got printed for another, 6 or 7 years.
Yeah.
So it was like, oh, that didn't help much.
Yeah, right.
And then, when the second one came along with Ms. Marvel, it was like, cool, I get to do it again,
Mm-hmm.
And so I worked on the second one, and the same thing happened. I think I did it, and it was like 8 or 10 years before they were actually going to print the thing in Marvel Fanfare or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So when the third part of it came along, it was like, sorry guys, I'm working in animation now, and it pays much better, and I'm not trying to convince anybody anymore that I can ink the work myself. And it was a fairly tight deadline to whatever, so I probably had passed on it.
Well, I just think that's really interesting in retrospect, because Rogue, permanently absorbing Ms. Marvel's powers has become such a staple with both of those characters. That's such a huge part of that. And so for that to be kind of like...
And all that is news to me. People keep telling me, like, you did the first Rogue. And I'm going, no, actually, the Rogue was an established character. I probably did... That was more of her origin story. I might have done part of that.
Yeah, Rogue shows up in Avengers as kind of a one-off villain, and then when she absorbs Ms. Marvel's powers, that's the version of the character that's used in like X-Men the Animated Series, and pretty much any popular incarnation of Rogue is the one where she absorbed the powers from Ms. Marvel, which is from your book, which kind of got shunted off into a, like I said, in an umbrella title later. So just wild that something like that it's become so legendary was kind of treated like an afterthought at the time.
And for me, I can probably tell you what the plots are of every one of Raymond Chandler's and Dashiell Hammond's books, but after I was a teenager, I really wasn't very much into comics. I liked
as a reader, and sure. Mm-hmm.
Like I would read Hawkman because Joe Kubert did it.
Okay.
And I discovered the Spirit through reprints. And I thought, wow, this stuff's really cool. My first stories that I got when I broke into comics, I was doing mystery stories for Charlton and Gold Key.
Uh-huh.
And Charlton I liked because, again, I got to ink the stuff myself, so I got to kind of see where that was. The pay was not that good, but like I said, it was exciting for me to do.
Sure.
Working for Marvel Comics, I was not a Marvel artist.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, I simply was not interested in the exaggerations. I never read the Fantastic Four and any of those books.
Okay.
when they were first. I think I probably looked at the first ones when they came out and read them, but I wasn't a big fan of that stuff. Whereas on the other hand, I was a big fan of Spider-Man because Steve Ditko did it. And
Sure.
I thought Steve Ditko was just an incredible artist. And
Yeah.
Doctor Strange even more.
Now, was there much collaboration with Chris Claremont? Because on the topic of the X-Men, and he's become sort of the legendary X-Men writer. Did you work with him very closely, or was it just sort of, here's the script, go ahead and do it?
I probably talked with Chris about a couple things when I was doing it. Chris was actually one of the earliest guys I worked with in comics. I think he did one of the stories for a vampire story for one of the black and white books. And
oh, okay.
Those were that was probably my first job at Marvel.
Okay.
Was again, I was working in the mystery books,
Mm-hmm.
and then the first regular series I was doing might have been some of the Shang-Chi stories, because again, that was Starlin and Englehart had kind of developed that stuff, and
Yeah.
I was a major Fu Manchu fan, so I was really excited about that. Was a little disappointed to see they didn't do that much with him in the series. So I mean, those were kind of my first experiences, but yeah, Chris I always enjoyed. I would see him when I would come into New York too, and we always enjoyed talking. The thing that always drove me, was like we all worked on plots. I worked on a plot with Chris. What I didn't learn was like draw your characters at least an inch below the top of the panel. There was going to be a lot of
lot of
dialogue.
script. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So that was always an issue.
That's hilarious. Well, we got to talk She-Hulk. I mean, when I see your name, that She-Hulk is the thing that comes to my mind. You were on Savage She-Hulk for 24 issues, I want to say, most of the run. Was that your first?
Right.
Was that one of your most long-running gigs on a series?
I think I did about 20 issues of G.I. Joe. And
Okay.
then the 24 of She-Hulk. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to sharpen my pencil. Okay. I'm talking and drawing at the same time.
That's all right. What are you drawing?
Oh, I do my own comic books now. Just they're my hobby.
Okay. So are you working on a Lori Lovecraft?
No, I wrapped up that series. I
Okay.
mean, the Lori Lovecraft stuff, what I discovered was that it required a level of concentration and a level of lust that I don't really have anymore in comics.
Got it. Now, it's interesting because the Lori Lovecraft stuff that you've done, and a lot of your drawings tend to have kind of a statuesque, old Hollywood vibe about that. And I feel like the Savage She-Hulk is kind of the exact opposite, where she's much more in the vein of like 70s Hulk with the ripped clothing and, wild hair and kind of monstery. Was that a decision just made, from on high, and that's just the directive for the book? Or how did that come about?
That's what John Buscema drew in the first issue, so I figured that's what I was
Just locking it in. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and nobody said, "Oh, she should have a costume," because it kind of was that antithesis to the character of like the first series was just like, "Oh my God!" Every so often I change into this raging beast.
Yeah,
and it's not like, well, when I do that, I really should go out and pick out a good costume to wear.
True.
I mean, it was like,
yeah.
I always found the conceit of costumes for superheroes completely acceptable in comics.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, when you put a character in a costume in a movie, you have to explain it because your movie audience does not understand why this character is going to dress that way.
Yeah.
What is that all about? Yeah, She-Hulk was like I said, it was fun because I look at the series and I can really see my growth as an artist and a storyteller over a 2-year period.
Sure. Yeah.
When I started on it, I was kind of like, okay, I've done work. I'm not the new guy breaking in anymore. So I was really able to kind of see myself grow from an established professional to whatever quality of the work. I think at the time, the guy that I was really impressed with was Frank Miller, was doing a lot of the stuff on Daredevil.
Yeah.
And I really liked his approach of storytelling, learned from Will Eisner. I mean, one of the things Frank and Will both did was they set a stage, and there was absolutely nothing on that stage unless it pertained to the story. You weren't drawing things in the background or whatever just because, like, oh, I like drawing that. Everything that you saw on that frame applied to the characters and what they were doing.
Okay.
And I also love the noir aspect of heavily shadowed. Again, I was far more into film, so at the time, I was looking at everything I could find in film, and like I was using a lot of film book reference for doing stuff.
Okay. Were there specific actors or actresses you were basing things on, like the look for Jen Walters? Was that anything you were pulling from old Hollywood, or just kind of following what was put in?
No, she was. I don't think I was doing anything with her. I remember one of the villains was my wife. I think we were dating and had broken up at the time or whatever. So and certainly there was a character in there called, I forget who he was, but I used Orson Welles as the.
Okay.
Whatever that character was.
I can picture what you mean. Yeah.
And I mean, I was always doing things like that along the way.
Mm-hmm. How much does your experience change when, you said with Ms. Marvel it was maybe 3 issues or something like that, whereas something like this when you're at 24, like how does the experience of being on the same book week after week for 2 years, you said, how is that a different experience than doing kind of more like one-off things? Like how does your process change?
You get tired of it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, I mean, I have the same thing with G.I. Joe. It's like, oh man, again, what you have to understand is my reaction to doing comics is, oh my God, I've dreamt about doing a She-Hulk my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
It was fun to do, but it was an assignment.
Yeah.
And I would enjoy getting them, and like I said, I was approaching them from a little different way of like, okay, I was far more interested in character bits.
Sure.
With how's the She-Hulk going to react to this? How's Jen going to react to this?
But one of the things I think is so fascinating about the Savage She-Hulk run, is that it feels like there's almost an equal weight put on Jen's law career as there is of the Savage She-Hulk doing her She-Hulk thing.
Oh, exactly. In fact, later on they were trying to do like, well, where are we going to go with the She-Hulk? And Dave kind of had his own bent too in terms of what he wanted to do with stories.
Yeah.
Which were like, okay, that's cool, but I wasn't that fascinated by some of the saving the microwave tower or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, whatever. For me, it was like, oh, wait, if I wanted to do a follow-up She-Hulk book, I thought the ideal book would be like, She-Hulk is hired by a movie studio to do a superhero thing,
mm-hmm.
so she can raise some money to pay for all the damage she's been doing to She-Hulk. I mean, that was like, okay, that's what I would be doing with She-Hulk,
Yeah.
And I never read any of the stuff John Byrne did when he reestablished the character, so I don't know what they were doing in that sense.
It's tonally very different. It's much more tongue-in-cheek and fourth wall breaking than the Savage run.
Which is what I would have done with the series, too. I mean, it was like, this stuff should be for fun.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other things was, like, I kind of, by the end of the run in the She-Hulk, I think I was doing, like I said, a creator-owned book, Sisterhood of Steel, at the time. And I was also, there was a whole list of people that they felt didn't really work at Marvel. And they're trying to phase them out.
Okay.
I mean, and there were good people like Chaykin and myself and whatever, but, this was all Shooter's more influence than anything.
Okay.
I was like, okay, you don't do things my way. We want to move on from you.
Well, that doesn't sound very stimulating of creativity, an atmosphere like that.
Plus, for me, it was a matter of, I knew that if and when the She-Hulk ended, I wasn't going to be getting any more work. So, I mean, it was, at the same time, I had just moved out here to California, too.
Yeah. Now, looking at your TV credit, it looked like you crossed paths with She-Hulk a little later on Hulk and the Agents of S.M.A.S.H. Did you work on storyboards of She-Hulk episodes of that show?
I did one that was a lot of fun because it was, I don't know if you've ever seen the Marlene Dietrich film called Blonde Venus.
I know what you mean. I haven't seen it, though.
But anyway, she has this whole thing where there's this whole chorus line leads out this, this orangutan. And the orangutan jumps up on a table and jumps up on stage. And then it proceeds to do kind of this slow striptease as one glove comes off and it's this, this beautiful hand. Then another glove comes off and it's this beautiful hand. And then she lifts off the head and it's Marlene Dietrich in this costume. And it's just like, it's just one of the, and they're playing this great music behind it. It's one of the great little bits in film. And I was like, well, I got to figure out a way to use that. I think I used it in my Offcast comic, something similar, but I had a chance to, they almost do it like shot for shot in this She-Hulk cartoon. So it was like, okay, that was fun. But by that time, animation for me was, I'd moved beyond that. I mean, I had worked for Boo Animation on Spawn, and that was a great job. And at the same time, I was working, I've been hired to do the comic book covers they were doing in Tales from the Crypt. And that was absolutely just like, I mean, I couldn't get more excited about, like, here I come, you know, this a guy from the Midwest who's never been on a movie set before, and all of a sudden I'm photographing and meeting everybody who's doing anything in Hollywood. And it was like, wow, this is cool.
Yeah.
And they were paying me about 5 or 6 times more for a cover than anybody was paying for what they were doing in comics.
Yeah.
That was like a dream job. Strangely enough, the guys that I worked with at HBO was Eric Radomski. And Eric then became the creative director of Marvel. So that's how I wound up doing some of those things. But
yeah, because you've got quite a few credits here. Avengers, Earth's Mightiest Heroes, Ultimate Spider-Man, Wolverine and the X-Men. So a lot of the Marvel animation that was going on at that time seems like you crossed paths with at some point.
Oddly enough, I found myself kind of in the same situation that working for Marvel Animation that I found myself working for Marvel comic books.
Mm.
Yeah. If there was anybody else around, I was going to get work.
I see.
One of the things that happens the longer you work is, I mean, like, for me, I loved doing live-action storyboarding because nobody handed you a model sheet and said, draw it in this style. They wanted you to draw realistically. And so when I was working in live action, that was ideally suited for me. Working in animation, everybody that came along, there were all these young directors who were going to be the next Orson Welles. Come hell or high water, they were going to get that kind of board out of you. It was like, A, you're not Orson Welles. You know? And B, I don't draw that style anyway. So
yeah.
it was kind of frustrating at times.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, I mean, you know, and the other thing you learned as an artist was that if you want to stay busy, you're going to hopscotch back and forth between. I worked in advertising, I worked in live action, I worked in animation, I was doing comic books, you know, whatever kind of paid the bills that month.
Yeah. So looking back, was that X-Men Annual 13, was that your most financially successful comic book ever?
You know, I think the most successfully financial might actually been I did a fill-in issue. They did this Punisher series. It was a 5-issue run. The deadline was so pressing on the last one that Carl Potts brought me in to pencil the book. And I had like 2 weeks to pencil the book.
Wow.
And, yeah. And when the book came out, I mean, I just got castigated by the press, castigated by the writer. You know, the inker was like, well, I did what I could with it.
Oh, jeez.
But the funny thing is, they've reprinted that book at least 8 or 10 times, and every time I've gotten the royalty on it.
Oh, wow. That's funny.
So it was one of those things where, like, I did it as a favor for Carl, and, you know, no good deed goes unpunished.
Wow. I guess so.
That was always one of the weird things working in comics. People either thought you were a genius or an idiot. And if you worked long enough, you were going to be both.
Huh.
So, I mean, eventually you were going to do that popular series or you were going to fall out of favor.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to remember that Norman Rockwell ended his career when he could no longer get work from Saturday Evening Post. That's kind of what happens to you as an artist. Again, like I said, as I evolved more as an artist, my style grew out of what was going to be acceptable for the way they were doing comic books.
Yeah.
I mean, and like I said, you do stuff and then you move on. And I had a great time working when I was doing comics, but like so many things, it's time to move on, to do something different.
Sure. I mean, it sounds like you've had a fascinating life and a fascinating career, and I've really enjoyed our conversation today. If people are looking for some of your current work or just want to find more out about you, what's a good place for them to do that?
I would go to my website.
Okay.
Vosart, VOZART.com.
Okay. Mike, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, you're welcome, Nick.
Best to you.
Well, that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it was. I wanted to have like a little, like, we need like a pop-up video for all of the names he was throwing out there.
I know.
Like Len Wein calling him up, asking him how to make fanzines and stuff. It was just like crazy. Like there was so many of those. I was like, oh, and then.
Nice that he, I was a little concerned when he had a reaction about working with Chris Claremont.
I know.
I was a little nervous, but then he was like, yeah, he was a great guy.
I know.
He spent a lot of time. So
yeah,
it turned out.
And
Okay.
he was saying they did some early like monster stuff together, like black and white in the old days.
Cool.
So yeah, that was pretty cool. That was pretty cool all around.
Well, I mean, if anybody wants to see more of his stuff or anything, he said his website. It's Vozart, VOZART.com.
Yeah.
So check him out over there.
Pretty comprehensive. A lot of things about his history, like pinups and different things that he's done.
And he said he's doing smaller stuff right now. Private, whatever.
Yeah, he has some things that you can purchase right there on the website, and also a lot of the old Hollywood kind of stuff that you can really see. Like he drew a lot of inspiration from there. So he's got a lot of cool stuff on that website. So yeah,
cool,
fun conversation. I was geeking out.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, next time we're going to be back to the animated series. We'll be doing Long Shot and
Long Shot.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you.
Listen,
okay, you're
I know.
aware.
It's Mojo. It's fine.
Okay.
I'm working through it with my therapist.
Okay. Good. Because last time it was just key in the ignition and you were out.
Yeah, I thought I could do it and I just couldn't. But
Last
this
minute.
time,
okay.
I'm in.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
I can do it. So it's that. It's Long Shot and it's Cold Comfort, which is that Iceman one.
It's the only Iceman one
that you were talking about.
I swear I don't think I've seen this episode.
I don't think I've seen. I think I said this the last time that I was talking to Eric that I don't remember seeing Iceman on this show.
No.
So
Me neither.
Maybe I've just never seen this episode.
Yeah.
So that'll be a fun little experience. So we'll talk about
Absolutely.
that. Eric will be back for that. And that brings us to the end, I guess. We're all done.
That's right.
Okay, well, thanks again to our guest, Mike Vosburg. It was a great chat with him. And thank you to Prophetic Music for our theme song. Previously on X-Men is brought to you by the Radio Meanwhile Network. Other shows on the network include 90s Music Got Me Like, This and Dorian Life, and 9021 Here We Go, which I'm going to be on soon.
That's right. There's an episode with the Corrs. And
I like the Corrs.
If we have a Corrs expert, you gotta be on there. Yeah.
Be involved in that.
That's
so
right.
that'll be fun to be over there. So you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter at Previously on X. Please rate, subscribe, and share this show wherever you get your podcasts. And see you next time.
So long.